Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you are watching this webinar. Again, this is Dave Nagel, and as always, I'm very excited to share with my colleagues and friends in Valley View School District. This is our next webinar in the webinar series as we're preparing some groups to join the cohorts of the Common Formative Assessment 2.0 work, or this is a review for those of you that have been through it. So today, we're going to dig into part 2 of creating effective scoring guides and look at how we connect what we put in the scoring guide to our success criteria targets. So there's another webinar that's separate, just specific to success criteria. There's one that's specific to scoring guides, and this kind of combines the two of them. So let's get started. Again, just a little bit of background about myself, if this happens to be your first webinar, which I would highly doubt that. But again, my background's been in middle and high school in terms of my practitioner stage, but I've been implementing Larry's work now for well over 16 years. And it started as a classroom teacher and then as an administrator at the school level and at the district level supporting CFA. But I've been presenting his work now for well over a decade. And I only say that to kind of honor Larry's work, but also instill that I've seen many proper adaptations of his key steps. And I want to stress that we have to adapt, but we also have to stay not within just the framework, but to make sure that we're using these, what we might call bread and butter practices to the best of our ability to impact our, as teachers and administrators, our ability to create proper inferences around student understanding so we can make the best adjustments and really use assessment as feedback for us as we kind of tie that mind frame in. Anytime we come together, it's really important that we kind of just stress these 3 points. And again, this isn't rocket science by any stretch of the imagination. Any assessment we ever put in place really comes down to these 3 points. What's my purpose? And then when do I have enough evidence to make a quality inference? The best way that we can make a quality inference from evidence when we're looking at classroom assessments is by the unwrapped standards, which then we will align to that success criteria target. And then I'm going to guide today how we can make sure we align that with the scoring guides. What we're asking students to demonstrate is exactly what we shared with them that they needed to do, and that aligns back to the standard. So when we talk about Larry's process, and it's not about just these 10 steps, and it's not about always following these 10 steps in order, but certainly what comes at the beginning, the priority standards and the unwrapping, when we're creating our post-assessment and creating that scoring guide, that we're going back to what were our true learning intentions? What were we talking to the students about and demonstrating with them in terms of their success criteria? That's critical that we're aligning those pieces. And this is where, for many teachers, it's going to be a tweak or an adjustment to make that shift in terms of what we're using and what we're putting on our scoring guides or rubrics. For others, it might challenge us a little bit to look at some of the things we're putting in front of students and say, that really wasn't even aligned with what I was asking them to do or what was aligned in the standard. So this is a great, hopefully, example for some to have some takeaways for how we can apply that from, as I said before, the standard, the learning intention into success criteria, and into the scoring guide. So this is kind of the framework I'm going to guide us through today. We have our unwrapped standard, create clear success criteria to create effective and empowering scoring guides. Effective in that they align with what we expected of the student so that there's clarity for both the teacher and the student, and empowering so that the students can early on in the process or earlier begin to guide their own learning. And as we know, that's critical as we're developing students' assessment capabilities. This all does come back to that thing that we've talked a lot about in Valley View since we ever started our visible learning work, and that teacher clarity, and making sure that we're as clear as we can be with what we're asking students to do, which will then be able to drive the effectiveness into our feedback that we provide. And certainly at all levels, we have a clarity problem. And this isn't something new. It's something that's been embedded in our schools for a long time where we're not aligning what we're really asking. And I sort of would challenge the administrators that are watching that as a classroom teacher, you have to have clarity in terms of what's expected of you in the classroom on a day in, day out basis. And you have to know how you'll demonstrate the things that we're doing and expecting in all Valley View classrooms. We have to have clarity across the board. And we really want to prevent this. I shared this in the last webinar on scoring guides. But far too often, students are guessing. And what this should do is demystify not only what they have to do, but eventually when we talk about grading, it should demystify that so that there's not this guess or this gamble where I'm writing what I think you want me to put down or I'm hoping that it's what was aligned. Students should know once they complete a constructed response item or anything that had a rubric how well they did. Within reason, they should be able to know how well they met the criteria if it's clear and concise, even when it's qualitative, even when it has a degree of subjectivity. Not everything will be easily measurable and quantifiable terms, and we'll talk more about that again throughout this webinar. But how do we create that solution to the clarity problem? Well, we do so with clear learning intentions into clear success criteria. And again, I think this is a great place to tie that in and validate and solidify some of the work we've been doing in Valley View, for the last couple of years. And certainly you're becoming a sort of a model district, not just in the area of in Illinois or near Chicago, but across the country. And we talk about districts that are really embedding that success criteria and aligning that clarity of understanding that we're able to garner, that you're able to garner when we align that to the PARCC results. The more students are clear in the expectations, we're seeing with rare exception increased achievement, which would make sense. And again, this kind of validates why that research is so powerful around why we're doing what we're doing. A couple of quotes from Mitch Albelson and his work around teacher clarity. I'm going to leave these up for just a minute. You see them in your working handout. But for students to take responsibility for their learning, see in that first quote, both the teacher and the students have to be clear about what is being learned and how they should go about it. Great couple of video clips some of you have seen if you've been with me from Rachel Schlechter and Sally Green around the importance for us to work on these, especially at the secondary level, but at all levels, to help students take more responsibility of their learning. I mean, it's a common phrase and a frustration from teachers, and I get some students, they don't want to do that. At the same time, we increase the ability for students to do that when we're clear and concise. And that bottom point about their motivation improving, it doesn't mean every student, but certainly it's going to increase how more motivated students could be so that they realize that what they're doing and their actions are really more driven to their responsibility for their learning. It really has a chance to increase some of the things that we desire the most in our classrooms. And then Shirley Clark, who's one of the leading experts around success criteria. What I love about Shirley is her work is solid and embedded in research, but it's very concise and down to earth and very applicable. And that the success criteria should summarize the key steps or ingredients the students need to meet our learning targets or learning intentions. And this is something that I'm hoping is a review for most of us. I'm going to go into a few examples, but we have our learning intention, our target, and then how do we break that down into clear, concise success criteria? And success criteria need to be these four things. They need to be concrete, measurable, and observable. Now, just because that they're concrete doesn't mean they can't be open to negotiation. Meaning, was that really a strong thesis statement? Was that really a concise conclusion? There's going to be the ability to have that qualifiable nature, which we must have, to have deep levels of rigor. So at times, they're open to negotiation. And again, I go back to some of the video clips from Sally and Rachel, who talked a couple things around, sometimes Rachel's quote was, we know what we want the students to learn. We got to think about how we want them to demonstrate it. And other times they're very clear on how they want them to demonstrate, and they're tweaking what they have to learn. And then Sally talks about how those targets on her whiteboard take up a lot of space, and sometimes they get a tweak or two after each lesson. So the idea that they're sort of etched in stone is something that we want to refute. Now, obviously, there's some elements that will be very concrete, some that will be very what we would call closed skills, whether or not you've correctly solved the problem. The computation is definitely going to be quantitative. How your explanation is in terms of how you were getting to that problem, whether you got it right or wrong, that's got that negotiation in there, and that's actually where we can dig deeper into student understanding or misunderstanding. I want to go back to our definition of scoring guides or rubrics. You also see this on your handout, but they're detailed success criteria. So we take the success criteria and we break it down and make it very explicit in objective terms, exactly what the students need to include in a constructed response item. What needs to be there? And this comes back to the metaphor I use like Dragnet, just the facts. Here's exactly what you need to have. We talk about that idea of hand to glove, meaning what's written in the directions should be clearly defined within the scoring guide. If it's within the scoring guide, it should be in the directions, and there shouldn't be anything else. So we're very clear, and I think at times this can help have us not over-rubricize everything or get caught up sometimes in the details in student work that aren't as important for the current lesson or activity. Sometimes we can get caught up into punctuation and spelling and things of that nature, which we're not saying they're not important, but that really wasn't what the learning intention or success criteria was about. And then we're giving feedback around things that are either less important or even unimportant, and take the student's direction off the things that are most important that are written within that standard that we've broken down. And when we kind of go back to everything we've been doing in Valley View now for the last few years, developing assessment-capable visible learners, When our scoring guides align with clear success criteria, we're going to increase how we're developing that assessment capability in our kiddos so that they know where they're going. It's a success criteria. They can monitor how they're going in their next learning steps based on how far away or close they are by using the scoring guides to help empower their own feedback from peers, from themselves, from the scoring guide itself as a way that they can get feedback and have them become more of their own teachers. And so I want to tie in just one other piece before we get into the nuts and bolts and technical side of this webinar, because we've seen, effective feedback doubles the speed of learning. Around 0.75, the average is 0.4. The key is that it's effective. And it's going to be effective when it's aligned to that success criteria. When I can align it to where I've asked you where to go, I can help you determine your next learning step. The purpose of feedback is to close that gap. Where am I now? Where do I need to be? What's missing? That's what's got to be critical. And if the scoring guide can't do that, we need to adjust something. The scoring guide should help students know where their next learning step, and at the same time have teachers help guide them through what's missing, or what possibly, if it's all present, what's their next learning step if they're at that achieves or proficient level. And it's a great place, and I'll tie this in back at the very end, how to bring in Hattie's instructional feedback model. Task feedback early in learning when the material's new or emergent. Process feedback around the strategy students are using to perform, and there's some degree of proficiency. Well, why do you think you have 2 of these 3 criteria? What do you think you're missing? Self-regulation, when there's a high degree of proficiency, and we'll look at that when we get into some of the exceeds category. What would be above and beyond related to that standard, and to give the students some choice in terms of how they could go above and beyond. I want to stress, with some constructive response items, we might not have an above and beyond. Sometimes we will. So the feedback model should guide us for the things that are critical within the standard, and hopefully be able to take students to the next level of learning, or the next level within that current piece of learning. So again, back to this little framework we're going to walk through the next couple examples, from the unwrapping to the success criteria to effective and empowering scoring guides. So again, we're trying to construct our scoring guides and link it back to the success criteria that we will have written. And certainly we might write our scoring guide and then tweak our success criteria, and vice versa. It's a malleable, fluid process. What comes first really doesn't matter, chicken or the egg, because we're almost going to have to go back at times and revise to some degree to create that alignment. So I'm going to walk us through high school social studies and then a couple middle school math examples. You see them on your handout. Here, the priority standard, which actually was from Colorado, the actual standard itself. I'm not sure exactly what standards we're using in Illinois right now, but one thing about the social studies or science standards is we have the reading and writing standards for literacy, history, literacy standards for history, science, and technical subjects. So the priority standard was to analyze the roles and activities of political parties, interest groups, and mass media, and how they affect the beliefs and behaviors of local, state, and national constituencies. Kind of a hard word to say if you're not concentrating on it. But then they were also kind of aligning within this assessment that a priority was to write arguments focused on precise claims, distinguishing the claim from an alternative claim, and the counterclaim. So it was technically a supporting standard, but the authors were kind of highlighting this was going to be something that we were going to really hone in on during this assessment. So I'm going to walk us through the examples. So we have our unwrapped standard on the left, taking the nouns, the roles, the activities of political parties, the mass media. On the right-hand side, we have our learning intentions. Understand how political parties and interest groups and mass media impact how people believe and act at the local, state levels. Develop an argument as to why certain factors influence people's beliefs, and state possible counterpoints to your claim. Those were the learning intentions. Apologize for that delay there. I was off on one of the slides. At least I thought I was. I thought I had the success criteria written below, and I realized I couldn't do that. So you see this in your handout. Again, I apologize if that was confusing at all there. I wanted to make sure I had the right slide come up on the screen. So what we see here is then the success criteria align to those learning intentions. Get more specific. You'll know you've met them when you can analyze evidence from multiple sources to make a strong argument or claim, and listen and expand upon two or possible counterpoints to your claims or arguments. So those are asterisk, they're noted with asterisks for a couple of reasons. One, they're linking back to that supporting writing standard, and also what the authors noted in this assessment, they were going to be doing this consistently over the course of the semester. So the argument and the evidence that students are gathering for this particular example will change, but they're going to need to continue to make arguments. They're going to continue to use multiple sources. For this particular unit of study, then it gets into the specifics of the content, determining the power and limitations of political parties, interest groups, and mass media. Identify possible or likely beliefs of some constituent groups, and indicate specific examples of how constituent beliefs drive their actions and their behaviors. Now, one of the behaviors of a constituent would be how they vote. So that's where the authors went with this particular example. So to guide us through their two response items. Now, I put here, this is a shorter constructive response items. We have short constructive response that could just be a sentence, or other times in this situation, it's almost a little bit towards the extended response. But I want to highlight a point that they did not go above and beyond with achieves. They didn't go to exceeds with this one. And I'll show you why they did that, at least their rationale in the next example. But their question was to the students, considering the results of the primary election back in the spring, write a 1 to 2 paragraph, a 1 to 2 paragraph essay is what it should be there, explaining how constituent beliefs may have been affected by political parties, interest groups, and mass media. So they wanted the students to write 1 to 2 paragraphs. I'm just going to go back and fix that here just in case anybody confused about it. There we go. Now, we see the achieves criteria. Accurately identify political parties and interest groups involved in that election. Identify 2 to 3 common constituent beliefs. State 2 to 3 constituent behaviors influenced by mass media. And explain how those examples reached voters and impacted the candidates they supported. Progressing and emergent is just 3 or 2 of the achieves. Now, what they didn't do is go above and beyond with exceeds for this particular one. If we go back to our feedback model, we can think about how we could apply feedback where you've identified some of the common constituent beliefs, but I'm not quite sure you identified how their behaviors were influenced, specifically in this one, by mass media, because that was a place that they went into for this particular one, this particular item in this question with the materials that they were providing the students. Now here's their extended constructive response, which is even longer in detail. The first one, again, 1 to 2 paragraphs, that really could be an extended, but certainly was shorter than this one. After analyzing your sources, demonstrate your understanding of the influence of political parties, interest groups, and mass media have on constituent beliefs and their voting behaviors. In a 3 to 5 paragraph essay, develop and defend a claim of which of those 3 you feel has the most power over political outcomes. So the students have gone through mass media, they've gone through political parties, they've gone through interest groups. Now they've got to make a claim as to which one they feel has the most power over the political outcomes, and to make a claim, to make an argument, and then defend it. And so that supporting standard of that arguing and defending and the counterclaim is really what's getting embedded here through their content. Then, as they say, and you see it, and as you see on your handout, here's what your essay must include. And you see these points. Develop a strong claim. Formulate a concise thesis to support it. You support your claims with textual evidence, accurate data. Accurately identify the powers influenced of the influence identified and the limitations of the influence identified. And you can see that back to the original success criteria for the unit. State 2 to 3 possible counterpoints to your claim. The writing standard was, what are the counterclaims that might be involved? So having the students listen, when you make an argument, a way to make your argument stronger is to go ahead and acknowledge where it doesn't hold complete water, and there's other arguments that are available, but why yours is the strongest is why I'm putting these pieces in place. Include a prediction and rationale for that related to the general election. That should tie back to why you feel this influence is the strongest, and include a terse conclusion statement that aligns well to your overall thesis. That's what you needed to be able to do. Now let's look at the scoring guide. And let's go first to that achieves category, and I'm going to go back to that point about hand to glove. What you see here is within these 6 points, which have a couple of sub-bullets under them, those go right back to what was asked of the students to put in place based on what was in the directions. We can see that hand to glove fit between what we asked them in the directions and now the criteria. Approaching is 4 of the 6. And what the teacher said here, your claim is supported by accurate evidence, statistical, historical event. That's all 1. So you got to get all three of those to get that one. Or to include accurate examples of the power and limitations of that influence, that's kind of one. I want to go to the exceeds, though. And this is where, when we talked about the feedback model with a chance to have students go to the next level, and there's some choice when there's a degree of proficiency. First, you have to include all of the achieves, but then you could do either of the following. Make a prediction of the election results. Should your claim not hold true, and why? What would happen if your claim is wrong? Would that change the outcome? Would it maybe just change how close it is? And then include some historical examples, more than one, refuting your claim from previous elections. Here were some elections where my claim wouldn't have held true. We never said that it holds true every time. It's not a law, it's a claim, it's an argument. So again, a couple of points here. What you see here is the direct connection back to the UNWRAP standard, back to the success criteria, back to the task, and now to the scoring guide. Within the scoring guide, again, that connection between what was in the directions to what we see in the achieves success criteria. Clear, if we said it was in the directions, we should put it there. And then again, I think that there's I really like the point where they said the claim, it's got to have all three of those to be the claim. So we don't have, you've hit 5 of the 9 or how many bullet points are here. As a footnote, this is also where, and we'll talk about this later down the road, it's not like the scoring guide term is so we can score to know where we're at in terms of proficiency, not score just for the grade. But this is where we might, as a classroom teacher, let's say the students nail the first 5. Would it be safe to say that they didn't completely meet the success criteria, but their conclusion at the end, while important, isn't half as important as the other pieces? So how we weight each one of these bullet points when we do eventually put it in the gradebook, so to speak, could be driven by the level of rigor and depth and importance within here. What you don't see is that there's misspelled words. And not that we're going to have the students turn in a bunch of garbage. We can add something like that in there as sort of a general term that there's always in your essay fewer than 3 spelling errors. Once there's 3, it's not like I'm taking off points. I'm just going to give it back to you and say, go fix it. But I'm not going to waste my precious time as a classroom teacher and confuse the students that you could have a well-spelled essay that makes a poor argument, and that's better than a strong argument that has some spelling errors. Spelling errors get fixed real quick by Microsoft Word. A weak argument has a lot more work to do. So again, this is where we want to be driven by that priority standard and what's in there. I'm going to walk us through a couple of math examples that you see, and I pulled these right from the book. Jan Christensen, who had written these, who's a fabulous author and a very strong consultant across the world in mathematics, and so I thought it was a great place to take his example. And first we have our priority standard. 6th grade standard, making tables of equivalent ratios, relating quantities with whole number measurements, finding the missing values in the tables, and plotting the pairs of values on the coordinate plane. Use tables to compare the ratios, and he was beginning to unwrap that. So here, just like the last example, I was able to get the success criteria on the same slide. We have our unwrapping on the left. The overall learning intention was to understand how tables can demonstrate how ratios of similar quantities, and how to find missing values. Again, we go back to the initial part of the standard, making tables, and we fill in the blanks. Using the tables, fill in the blanks. So then that was the overall learning intention. That's for me as the teacher. As a student, Jan came up with was that you will be able to find missing values and explain how you're able to do so. Create and use tables to find ratios, and create and use tables to compare ratios, and then plot pairs of values on coordinate planes. So I'm going to guide us through several of his items. Now, again, in math, one of the things we've talked a lot about is the critical need for students to close read, and certainly at times to write. In all 3 of these examples, there is not an exceeds. Not that there couldn't be for some, but this is where math teachers have to make that kind of choice and decision. Is this a time for the students to go above and beyond or connect it to something else? Or is it a time and place where we're just looking at them achieving the success criteria? So a couple examples. First one, you see the question. The table below shows equivalent ratios of 7 to 5. Fill in the missing values and explain how you determine the missing values. We look down at the left. We see from the question to the achieves category. Correctly include the missing values. Correctly explain how the relationship between the numbers at the top and the bottom are used, and explain how the values were added to the tables. So we can see that direct connection. Approaching as you met 2 out of the 3, meets as 1 or 0 of the achieves. Here's another one directly aligned with that same example, same part of the standard. The ratio of cats to dogs at a local neighborhood was 2 to 3. Use the ratio to fill in the table with equivalent ratios plot the ordered pairs from the table onto the coordinate plane. Correctly includes the missing ratios, correctly plots the ordered planes from the table onto the coordinate plane. Here, there was only two. We either have both of them or you met one or the other. But it's not, again, about grading and what's 3 points or what's 2 points. Is it 2 points? Is it 1? But this helps me guide where the student is, and the student can guide where they are in terms of their learning and understanding to monitor what their next learning steps are. Here's one more. And again, with the standard back in there, kind of highlighting and pulling it back. And this is an example of a standard that really it's the unwrapping alone can help us create very solid success criteria. Very clear. There's very quantitative measurement or quantitative skills embedded in here. In the social studies example, there was very qualitative. That's why we had to break that down a little bit more. But here, it's almost written for us in a sense when we break that standard down. But if there's 36 dogs in the neighborhood, which would be an awful lot of dogs, how many cats will there be? Use the table of equivalent ratio and ordered pairs on the coordinate plane to make your prediction. Number of cats, explain your prediction. So here, they make an accurate prediction of how many cats there will be, correctly calculate the number of cats, correctly explain your prediction. You see meets and achieves. So now we can again tie back what we see in the standard to the success criteria, which goes right back to that alignment between unwrapping success criteria and then what we're asking students to do in the problems or items that we're putting on our assessment, and to have as much of that clarity as we can. So kind of wrapping up back to what we were kind of designing in this webinar, constructing that scoring guide, linking it back to the success criteria. And as a final footnote, this is again where that instructional model for feedback is coming in. We have students that are getting a couple of the achieves and they're on the emergent or progressing. Is it a time to not give them the task feedback? Is it a way to help them guide themselves with their strategies? If they're completely emergent, we're going to jump right in. And then in certain places, that self-regulation comes in when there's a high degree of proficiency. What might them help go to the next learning step? And in the social studies example, it was easy to do within that one item to go above and beyond. And some of these math problems, to be honest, in the actual assessment is when Jan tied in another standard that had to do with making predictions about force and mass and things down that not force and mass, but with making a prediction over time and ratios over time. That's where he added some of those into that assessment piece, which you can see in the book in chapter 6. So again, the feedback model really will help us align, or the scoring guide will help us align when we use the feedback model. And sometimes, even with language arts or any other subject, we might not have an exceeds. That self-regulation might come into play when we're getting later in the unit and tying multiple standards together. As always, thoughts or questions on this or any of our webinars or any of our conversations, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email at davenagelvlplus@gmail.com. As always, I'm honored and thrilled to work with my friends and colleagues in Valley View. I think this is such an amazing opportunity to get many teachers through a process so we can have a even deeper shared language of learning and a deeper understanding of some of the same assessment pieces, which then we get to adapt and apply for our own needs at the 7th grade math team level or high school algebra level or high school biology level. It's the same framework, but how we apply it should have the adaptability where we're all on the same proverbial page around our assessment pieces and understanding, but we're not boxing anybody in because certain subject matters will have things different. For example, as we saw today between math and language arts. Thanks so much as always. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk very soon.